If you can do it safely, stand up, find a wall or a countertop close by just in case, and lift one foot off the ground. Don't hold on to anything yet. Just see how long you can stand there, on one leg, before you wobble or your raised foot has to touch back down. Hold that number in your head. We're coming back to it before this video is over. Here's the fact I promised you, and it's one you can go verify yourself. Inside your inner ear, sitting on a patch of tissue smaller than a grain of rice, there are microscopic hair cells. Yes, hair cells, the same basic word used for the ones connected to hearing. Except these particular ones don't detect sound, they detect gravity. And starting sometime in your 40s, long before you ever noticed a single wobble, your body begins quietly losing them. This is not one of those videos where I tell you to drink more water, stand on a wobble board for 6 weeks, and call it reversing aging. I'm not going to do that to you. What I want to do instead is take you inside your own skull and show you, piece by piece, what's actually happening when your balance shifts after 60. Not because you're falling apart, but because your brain is doing something remarkably intelligent with less information than it used to have. By the end of this, you'll be able to explain to another person, in plain language, exactly why turning around quickly in a dim room feels different than it did at 30, why standing on one leg gets harder years before anything else does, and what that early wobble is actually a signal of. So let's start with what you can actually feel, because the feeling always arrives long before anyone calls it a diagnosis. Most people don't notice their balance changing while standing still on flat ground in good light. That part stays fairly stable for a long time. Where it shows up first is in the transitions, standing up out of a low chair and feeling the room tilt for half a second, turning your head quickly to check for a car, and the world seeming to lag a beat behind the movement. Glancing down at a menu or a phone screen and then looking back up at someone's face, and needing a half second for things to settle into focus. Walking from a bright kitchen into a dark hallway at night and suddenly needing a hand on the wall you never used to need. Closing your eyes to wash your face in the shower and feeling far less steady than you'd have guessed. None of that is dramatic. That's exactly the point. And it's worth saying plainly instead of dressing it up. This isn't a collapse. It's a narrowing. The conditions under which your balance still performs well shrink a little. Good light, flat ground, slow movements. While the conditions that expose the gap widen. That one-leg test I had you try a minute ago is a real measure balance clinicians actually use, precisely because standing on 2 feet hides a problem that standing on 1 foot reveals immediately. Now let's go inside the ear and find out why. Deep in your inner ear, past the parts responsible for hearing, sits a completely separate structure called the vestibular labyrinth. Think of it as your body's internal spirit level. Except instead of one bubble in a tube, you have 5 separate sensors working together. 3 curved tubes called the semicircular canals, which detect rotation, and 2 small pouches called the utricle and the saccule, which detect straight-line movement and, critically, the constant pull of gravity itself. Inside the utricle and saccule, sitting on top of a thin, gel-like membrane, are tiny crystals made of calcium carbonate, the same mineral found in chalk and seashells. They're called otoconia. Because they have weight, gravity pulls on them slightly more than it pulls on the fluid around them, and that tiny difference bends the hair cells underneath, which is how your brain constantly knows, even with your eyes closed, which way is down. Here's where the aging part comes in, and this isn't a guess. In the 1970s, a researcher named Ulf Rosenhall examined inner ear tissue from people who had died at different ages under a microscope and counted the hair cells directly. What he found was that the decline starts earlier than most people assume, often by midlife, and continues steadily from there. Not a sudden cliff, but a slow, ongoing loss of the very cells that convert gravity into a signal your brain can use. Later researchers looking at the otoconia themselves found something else worth knowing. The crystals don't just sit there unchanged forever. Over the decades, they can fragment, become less dense, or come loose from the membrane they're meant to sit on. So you have 2 things happening in the same small piece of tissue at the same time. Fewer working sensors. And the crystals those sensors depend on becoming less reliable. That's the first honest answer to, why does my balance change after 60? It isn't vague. It's a specific, measurable, physical change in a structure roughly the size of a pea. Here's a fact that puts that in perspective, and it's one that explains why this particular decline is different from, say, a cut on your skin. In humans, once a vestibular hair cell dies, it does not grow back. That's not true of every animal. Researchers who study regeneration, including work going back to Jeffrey Corwin's studies on hair cells in fish and birds, found that some species can regenerate these exact same sensory cells throughout life, which is part of why fish and birds don't experience the same kind of age-related balance decline humans do. We didn't inherit that ability. Whatever hair cells you're born with are, broadly speaking, the ones you're working with for the rest of your life. That single fact is the reason almost everything effective for this problem targets the brain's compensation, not the ear's regrowth, and it's exactly what the practical section later in this video is built around. It's also worth being honest that this decline doesn't move at the same speed for everyone, and the reasons for that are fairly well understood. Certain antibiotics, particularly a class called aminoglycosides, and certain chemotherapy drugs, such as cisplatin, are directly toxic to hair cells and can accelerate this same loss well beyond the normal pace of aging, which is why doctors monitor balance and hearing closely in patients taking them. Loud noise exposure over a lifetime plays a role too, mainly on the hearing side of the inner ear, but the two systems sit close enough together that damage doesn't always stay neatly confined to one. None of that changes the underlying mechanism we're describing. It just explains why your neighbor, who's the same age as you, might be steadier or shakier than you are, for reasons that have nothing to do with willpower. You might reasonably ask how anyone knows all of this about a living person, since Rosenhall's original counting was done on tissue examined after death. That's a fair question, and the honest answer is that the tools have moved on since then. Clinicians today can test vestibular function in a living patient using something called a vestibular-evoked myogenic potential test, which plays a brief sound or vibration into the ear and measures, through electrodes on the neck and around the eyes, how strongly the muscles connected to the utricle and saccule respond. Weaker, delayed responses on that test line up with exactly what Rosenhall found under the microscope decades earlier, which is part of why researchers consider this particular mechanism well confirmed rather than a theory resting on old data alone. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly, though, and it's the part that actually matters most for what you feel day to day. Losing some hair cells doesn't mean the inner ear goes silent. It means the signal gets noisier. Each hair cell, when it's bent by gravity, changes the rate at which the vestibular nerve fibers connected to it fire electrical signals toward the brainstem. With a full population of healthy hair cells, that signal is clean. A clear, confident report of exactly which way you're tilted and how fast you're rotating. Lose a meaningful share of them, and the same physical tilt now produces a weaker, less consistent electrical pattern. The information isn't gone. It's degraded, the way a radio station starts to crackle with static the further you drive from the tower, even though the station itself is still broadcasting. This matters because your brain doesn't just receive that signal passively. It cross-checks it, constantly, against two other sources of information: your eyes, and the pressure and stretch sensors in your joints, muscles, and the soles of your feet, a sense called proprioception. Under normal circumstances, all three sources roughly agree, and your brain doesn't have to work very hard to produce a steady sense of upright. But when one of the three starts sending a noisier, weaker signal, the other two don't just sit there passively. The brain has to actively decide, moment to moment, how much weight to give each one. This is the one idea I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video, because everything after this builds on it. Picture your brain as a conductor standing in front of three musicians. One is your eyes, one is your inner ear, one is your feet and joints. For most of your life, all three musicians play at a similar, confident volume, and the conductor barely has to intervene. As the inner ear musician gets quieter, not silent, just quieter, harder to hear clearly, a skilled conductor doesn't ignore it. The conductor turns up the other two. More attention gets pulled toward vision. More attention gets pulled toward the feet. That reweighting isn't a malfunction. It's the single most important thing your nervous system does to keep you upright as this part of your inner ear ages, and researchers who study postural control, including Faye Horak at Oregon Health and Science University, have spent decades documenting exactly this kind of sensory reweighting in older adults, using tests that selectively remove one sense at a time and watch how the body compensates for its absence. That same weakened signal explains something else too, something most people never connect back to the inner ear at all. That half-second of lag when you turn your head quickly, or the moment it takes for a face to snap into focus after you glance up, that's not your eyes failing on their own. The same vestibular nerve pathway that tells your brain which way is down also drives something called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, a genuinely elegant system that moves your eyeballs in the exact opposite direction of your head, automatically, so that whatever you're looking at stays still on your retina even while your head is moving. It's why you can shake your head side to side right now and still read this sentence clearly. As the same hair cells that feed that reflex weaken with age, the reflex gets slightly less precise, and text or faces can blur for a fraction of a second during a fast head turn, a symptom specialists call oscillopsia when it's pronounced. It's usually mild in ordinary aging. But it's the exact same mechanism we've been building this whole time, just showing up in your eyes instead of your feet. So where does all that reweighting actually go? Not back into your ear. Into your eyes, your legs, and one more organ we haven't talked about yet, your cerebellum. The vestibular nerve doesn't connect directly to conscious thought. It runs first into a cluster of nuclei in the brainstem, and from there into the cerebellum, a fist-sized structure tucked under the back of your brain, responsible for smoothing out and coordinating movement in real time. The cerebellum takes that slightly noisier gravity signal, compares it instantly against what your eyes and legs are reporting, and issues the tiny, constant muscular corrections that keep you from swaying. Corrections so small and so fast you never consciously feel them happening. Brain imaging studies on aging in general have found modest volume reductions in the cerebellum over the decades, and it's worth being honest about that word, modest. It's a real, measured change, but it's gradual, not the kind of dramatic shrinkage that would explain a sudden fall on its own. It's one more small contributor layered on top of the inner ear changes, not a separate crisis. Here's the practical result of all that reweighting, and it explains something a lot of people notice but never trace back to its actual cause. Because your brain now leans more heavily on vision to stay upright, your balance becomes measurably more dependent on the quality of the light around you and on how visually busy or predictable the space is. Stand in a bright, still room, and your eyes hand the brain excellent, high-confidence information, so the inner ear's weaker signal barely matters. Now stand in a dim room, or on a patterned carpet, or in a moving crowd like a busy grocery aisle, and the visual information your brain has been leaning on gets noisier too, right at the moment it needed it most. That's the specific reason so many people in their 60s and 70s feel steady at home but strangely unsteady in unfamiliar places, in low light, or the instant they close their eyes in the shower. It isn't that the situation is objectively more dangerous. It's that it's the one situation where the backup system your brain has quietly been relying on for years suddenly loses its advantage. There's a second, stranger version of this same vision dependence that's worth naming, because you've almost certainly felt it. Stop your car at a red light next to a large truck, and when the truck creeps forward, you can feel your own foot twitch toward the brake, convinced for a split second that your car is rolling backward, even though your inner ear is reporting, correctly, that you haven't moved at all. Stand at the bottom of an escalator watching the stairs move, or ride a moving walkway in an airport and then step off it, and you can get a similar brief lurch. That's your visual system delivering a strong, confident signal of motion, and because your brain has been trained by decades of experience, and lately by necessity, to trust vision heavily, it can momentarily overrule an inner ear that's telling the truth. It's harmless, and it passes in a second or two, but it's a clean demonstration of exactly the reweighting we've been discussing, caught in the act. Quick moment, because I promised I'd only do this once. If any part of this sounds familiar, if you've noticed you're steadier at home in daylight than you are getting up at night for the bathroom, put that in the comments, because I think a lot of people watching this have never had a name for that pattern until right now. Then let's finish the picture, because there are two more pieces that tie all of this together. The second backup musician in that orchestra, your feet and joints, isn't in pristine condition either, and this is worth knowing honestly rather than assuming your legs are the reliable half of the equation. The skin on the soles of your feet is packed with pressure-sensing receptors that report exactly how your weight is distributed and how the ground beneath you is shifting. Research measuring vibration and pressure sensitivity in the feet has consistently found that this sense also declines gradually with age, for reasons overlapping with, but distinct from, what's happening in the ear: slower nerve conduction, fewer functioning receptors, thicker or drier skin reducing contact sensitivity. So the conductor is turning up two backup musicians who are themselves playing slightly quieter than they used to, decades into this same process. That's not a reason for alarm. It's a reason the practical steps later in this video target the feet specifically, rather than just telling you to be more careful. There's one more thing your body does about all of this, almost entirely without your permission, and you've probably already started doing it without noticing. Gait researchers who study how older adults walk have consistently documented a shift toward a wider stance and shorter, more deliberate steps, especially on uneven or unfamiliar ground. That widened stance isn't weakness, and it isn't clumsiness. It's your nervous system unconsciously increasing your base of support, the same way you'd naturally spread your feet further apart while standing on a moving bus. It's an intelligent, automatic adjustment to a genuinely smaller margin for error, made by a system that's still working hard to keep you upright. Now, that same loosening of the otoconia crystals I mentioned earlier has a second consequence, separate from the gradual signal weakening, and this one can feel far more dramatic in the moment, even though it's usually harmless. If a few of those calcium carbonate crystals break free from the utricle and drift into one of the semicircular canals, they can create a false rotation signal every time you tip your head a certain way, rolling over in bed, looking up at a high shelf, tilting your head back at the hairdresser. For a few seconds, that canal reports spinning that isn't actually happening, and the room seems to lurch. This condition has a name: benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, usually shortened to BPPV, and it becomes noticeably more common with age precisely because the crystals responsible for it become more prone to breaking loose over time. It's genuinely treatable, often in a single office visit, using a specific sequence of head movements a trained clinician can guide you through. If you're experiencing sudden spinning episodes, that's a conversation for a doctor, not something this video is trying to diagnose for you. Put the weaker baseline signal, the quieter backup sensors, and the occasional false alarm together, and you start to see why balance-related falls climb sharply in exactly this age range. In the United States, the health agencies that track this consistently find that roughly 1 in 4 adults over 65 experiences a fall in a given year, and falls remain the leading cause of injury among older adults. That statistic gets repeated constantly without ever being explained, which is a shame, because now you actually know the mechanism sitting underneath it. It isn't clumsiness. It's a sensory system running on a smaller budget, doing genuinely impressive compensatory work that occasionally gets caught in exactly the wrong combination of dim light, uneven ground, and a quick head turn. It's also worth being honest about the timeline, because after 60 was never really a single cliff edge. For most people, the changes we've walked through are modest and easy to miss through their 60s, showing up mainly as that occasional half-second wobble or the need for a hand on the wall in the dark. By the 70s, the same mechanisms have usually progressed enough that more people notice them in daily life, which is exactly why that decade is when formal balance and fall risk screening becomes genuinely worthwhile. Not because something new has gone wrong, but because the same slow process that started in your 40s has simply accumulated. In the 80s, the combined effect of a weaker vestibular signal, quieter proprioception in the feet, and the modest cerebellar changes we discussed is a large part of why fall prevention becomes such a central focus of geriatric medicine. None of that is meant to alarm you. It's meant to explain why this video lands differently, depending on whether you're watching it at 58 or at 83. And why starting the practical steps early matters more than starting them perfectly. Before I get into what actually helps, I want to give you an honest accounting of what's solid here and what isn't, because I'd rather earn your trust than impress you for 5 minutes. The hair cell decline Rosenhall documented and the general pattern of otoconia degrading with age are about as well established as anything in this field. They've been replicated across multiple studies examining inner ear tissue directly. The idea of sensory reweighting, the brain leaning harder on vision and proprioception as the vestibular signal weakens, is also well supported, largely through the kind of controlled postural testing Horak and other researchers in her field have run for decades. The link between weakened vision, proprioception, vestibular function, and fall risk is well established too, through large population studies, including work by researchers such as Stephen Lord in Australia. Where things get softer is in the precise numbers. I'm not going to hand you a specific percentage of hair cells lost by a certain age, because different studies, using different tissue samples and different counting methods, land on somewhat different figures, and I'd rather tell you the truth, that the decline is real and substantial, than give you a number that sounds precise but isn't reliable. The cerebellar volume changes I mentioned are measured and real, but modest, and exactly how much they contribute to everyday wobble compared to the inner ear changes is still being actively researched rather than settled. Holding those two categories apart, what's firmly proven and what's a reasonable but less certain inference, is exactly what lets the rest of this actually be useful to you. So knowing all of that, what do you actually do with it? Not a list of 10 habits. 3 specific things, each one aimed directly at a piece of the mechanism we just walked through. First, take the reweighting seriously by giving your eyes the best possible information, because we just established your brain now depends on vision more heavily than it used to. That means fixing the lighting in the exact spots where the transitions happen. A night light in the hallway between your bedroom and the bathroom, a light switch within reach of the bed instead of across the room, and enough light on staircases that you can see the edge of each step clearly. It also means getting your vision checked yearly rather than every few years, because your brain can only lean on your eyes as a backup system if what they're sending it is genuinely sharp. This won't fix your inner ear. It restores the advantage to the one sensor your brain is now leaning on hardest, and you'll know it's working when you can walk from your bedroom to the bathroom at 3 in the morning without pausing to let your eyes adjust first. Second, train the proprioception side of that same reweighting, deliberately, because your feet and joints are the other backup musician the conductor is turning up. The simplest version of this is standing near a countertop, holding on lightly at first, and practicing shifting your weight from 2 feet down to 1, working toward the kind of unsupported single-leg stance I had you try at the very start of this video, aiming for a controlled 10 to 20 seconds per side, once you're steady enough not to need the counter at all. If that feels like too much on its own, Tai Chi is worth mentioning specifically, not as a vague wellness suggestion, but because a well-known randomized trial led by researcher Fuzhong Li at the Oregon Research Institute found that a structured Tai Chi program measurably reduced the rate of falls in older adults, almost certainly by improving exactly this kind of proprioceptive and postural control. Twice a week, for a season, is enough to start seeing the benefit. Done correctly, you should feel your calf and ankle muscles making small, constant corrections rather than one big wobble. If you're swaying more than a few degrees off-center, hold onto the counter a little longer before trying it unsupported. It won't restore hair cells you've lost. It trains the systems compensating for them to compensate better. Third, and this one surprises people, you can partially retrain the vestibular system itself, even after some of it has weakened, through a specific category of exercises called vestibular rehabilitation, built around deliberately provoking small amounts of that eye-head mismatch on purpose, in a safe, controlled way, usually by moving your eyes and head in opposite directions while staying focused, on a fixed point, for short, repeated sessions. A typical starting version has you fix your eyes on a single letter or mark on the wall at eye level, then turn your head slowly from side to side, or up and down, while keeping that letter in sharp, unblurred focus the entire time, for 1 or 2 minutes, a few times a day. This approach traces back to exercises originally developed by Cawthorne and Cooksey in the 1940s, and it's been refined since by specialists in the field, including physical therapist and researcher Susan Herdman, whose work helped establish it as a standard clinical treatment. The reason it works is genuinely elegant. Your brainstem and cerebellum are capable of a real, measurable degree of relearning, called central compensation, essentially recalibrating how much weight to give a slightly noisier inner ear signal based on repeated practice. This is the exact same vestibulo-ocular reflex we talked about earlier, the one that keeps text and faces from blurring when you turn your head. And it's trainable. It typically needs to be taught properly by a vestibular physical therapist rather than improvised alone, and it won't regrow lost hair cells, but it can measurably improve how efficiently your brain uses the ones you have left. So go back to that moment at the start, you, standing on one foot, counting the seconds before you wobbled or set your foot back down. That wobble was never a verdict on you. It was a message, arriving from a piece of tissue smaller than a grain of rice, reporting honestly that it has fewer working cells than it used to, and a brain on the other end of that message doing something quietly remarkable, redistributing its trust across your eyes and your legs in real time, second by second, just to keep you standing in a doorway, at a countertop, at the top of a staircase. Every hallway light you now reach for, every hand you place on a wall you didn't used to need, isn't proof that something is failing. It's proof that something in you is still paying extremely close attention, compensating for a loss you couldn't see, using tools you never knew you had. Balance was never really about the inner ear alone. It was always a conversation between three senses and a brain refusing to let any one of them go silent without a fight. Understanding that conversation, that's the part your body has been trying to tell you all along.